All right, I'm Grady. Welcome to NYAFF Chat. And we've got on this very special edition director Junfeng of The Apprentice, which opens in New York tomorrow at the Village East Cinemas. Thanks for joining us. You are in Tokyo right now?
Yes, I am in Tokyo right now.
I
I've
appreciate
just
you being
arrived,
here.
yes. Yeah.
So the first thing I have to ask is, as sort of being involved with the film and the release and everything, you guys were picked to be Singapore's submission to the Academy Awards. What does that do for your film? Does that help it at all in Singapore and other markets?
Well, judging by how much the distributors like it on the posters, I suppose it's meant to be helpful. Yeah, I think it's been it's been a boost, I think, in terms of publicity for the film. It's my second film. It's the first time the Singapore Film Commission has selected my film to represent Singapore. So I'm very thankful for that, and also given the subject matter and how sensitive it could be, I'm very thankful that they've selected this film despite all that.
That's what I wanted to ask you is, because I know the subject matter, which is capital punishment, and the Singaporean justice system, is very sensitive. Were you surprised that the government selected the film as the submission?
Well, I was pleasantly surprised, yes. I think well, last year there weren't many Singapore films that were out there. There were two films that was in Cannes, but apart from that, I suppose one that has the potential of being distributed in the US, and also a story that's compelling enough for consideration by the Academy. I suppose Apprentice was a natural choice. We were just concerned if the subject matter might be a problem, but it turned out to be okay. So yeah, we're just happy for that.
So why did you decide to make this film in the first place?
Well, this capital punishment is something that I've always been concerned with for a long time, and in thinking about how I wanted to address it in my second film, I thought the point of view of an executioner is something that hasn't been seen very much, especially in films, and so I had a genuine curiosity for what it means to be an executioner, someone who is empowered to kill, and if it came from a point of view of a young man who needs to sort of become the assistant and apprentice of the executioner and eventually take over. What are the moral and ethical conflicts and dilemmas that this person goes through? So it's something that I was very curious to find out myself about, and I thought a character study of someone like that would be interesting, and it presents a different perspective on an issue that is contentious, I think, in many parts of the world.
There are a lot of, not just the executioner and the apprentice, but you also spend time on the families of the people who are sentenced to die. And the details are really interesting. What kind of research did you do for the film?
Well, I met a couple of former executioners to understand from their point of view what it might have been like. I also spoke with religious counselors who had walked with inmates on their final walks, and families of those who had been executed, because quite often when we look at narratives surrounding capital punishment and death row, we are usually only looking at the prisoner and what the person has done. And we often forget that this person also leaves behind people, families, and that was a point of view that I was also very interested in finding out. And then in sort of combining the 2 points of view in the protagonist Aiman, who kind of embodies both sides of the coin, one where he wears the uniform and needs to perform his duties, and the other where he is very much a casualty of the death penalty because his father had been executed. So this duality was something that I thought would be interesting in exploring, and having it presented in this character perhaps brings the conflict a lot deeper.
Did you have some preconceived notions about capital punishment that you changed doing your research?
Well, I had preconceived notions of what an execution might be, and I remember meeting the executioner, the very first executioner that I met. I remember being very nervous when I was going to him, because I had read about him before. This was a person who had executed hundreds in his lifetime. So and he's retired now. He was retired by then, and I was going to his home and meeting his family, and I wanted to hear from him. But 5 minutes into the conversation, I forgot he was the hangman, because he was just such a jocular and charismatic guy, sort of this grandfather character that you would love to have a chat with at a coffee shop. So that was very eye-opening, because this dark, mysterious character that I had in mind at that time just disappeared, and it became a lot more human, who this person was, and that helped me in understanding the character I was writing at that time very much. But at the same time, it took me a while to sort of reconcile these different images that I had in my mind of this person. Yeah.
Did he see the film?
I'm not sure if he did, because by the time I met him, he already had mild dementia. So I've heard that he's deteriorated quite a bit. So he probably won't be able to watch it. Yeah.
Did any of the people you interviewed, any of the executioners or religious ministers and things like that, have any of them seen the film? Because I'm curious, that must be very stressful for you.
Yes. Many have seen it, and well, one of the excuse me, the counselor that I spoke with, she also saw it, and she texted me, and she said she appreciated it very much. Of course, there are details that are not necessarily factual in how the procedures are actually done, but I did take some creative license in sort of finding that human truth, and that was to me more important than being 100% faithful to what the processes are. But I think the final outcome is very close to what it actually is. So I'm very pleased.
So when you filmed the movie, it was shot in Australia, right? Why did you make that decision?
To me, the prison space is not just a physical space, it's also very much a psychological space. and I was looking for a prison that was old enough, historic enough, to be able to kind of represent visually Ayman's psychological space, because as he journeys through the prison, he is very much sort of finding his way into himself, into understanding a past that he wasn't really in touch with, and so that visual representation needed to be very evocative. The prisons in Singapore are very new and rather sterile in their own way, and I thought, even if I had access to them, and even if I was granted permission to film in there, it might not have been ideal for the film. And so I happened to be in Australia a lot during that period, in those few years, and I was Googling for prison spaces I was Googling it first for Southeast Asia, if there was any. It turned out that most of the places that we went looking for were not available or not suitable. But in Australia, there happen to be many abandoned prisons that are available for filming. And I went to do a recce initially, and it was just a couple of the spaces, one in Maitland Jail in Hunter Valley, and another in Parramatta Jail, which is half an hour from Sydney. They were perfect because they were British colonial, which was what I was looking for, because Singapore used to be a British colony, and we inherited the laws from the British, and at the same time, logistically, we could essentially have the entire prison to ourselves without any bureaucracy that gave us problems. So we decided then to bring the entire team for about a week to New South Wales in Australia to film these scenes. It made the budget a lot higher, but I think it was worth it.
And can you talk a little about your two actors? Where did you find them, and how did you convince them to be in the film?
Well, casting was a very interesting process for us. We decided to cast sort of colorblind because I don't know if you know this, but in Singapore we are very multicultural, and so we were looking for Chinese actors, Malay actors, Indian actors, and I didn't really mind which ethnicity these actors would come from, although they would affect what language the film would eventually be in. What I was looking for was a chemistry, and eventually with Fir Rahman, who is a new actor in Singapore. He's done quite a bit of TV and stage, but it was his first feature film. And Wan Hanafisu, who is a veteran actor in Malaysia. He's been in several films before, and we paired them up, and the chemistry was just very natural. It was interesting because we were casting in both Singapore and Malaysia, so we had to fly up and down to look for actors. And eventually, when we found these two, we made them do workshops together before we finally decided on them.
And did those workshops change the script at all?
No, I think the way we shot it was pretty much very close to what the script was. Although because both actors turned out to be Malay, and therefore their private conversations would be in Malay, and that's a language that I don't speak. So I got a friend on board. He's a playwright, Irfan Kasban, who helped us translate the script, translate the dialogue into Malay, and he was on set as well with me as I was directing those scenes. But the language, it wasn't turned out to be not that difficult because although it's a language I don't speak, it's still a familiar language, so I could hear a lot of the nuances in the language.
I'm curious because I remember I used to work for HAF, and I remember seeing a proposal for this many, many years ago, I think. You've been working on this movie for how many years?
It would be from start till we've premiered the film. It was about 5 years. First started writing it in late 2011, I think, or mid 2011. And the first time it went to a project market was at the Rotterdam Cinemat.
So, how has the film changed from that very first concept until now? Is there some way that it's really changed? I mean, 5 years is a big part of your life. You've obviously changed. So, how has the film changed in that time?
Well, I think conceptually we kept very faithful to what we initially wanted. The way the film ends, without spoiling it for people who haven't seen it, is the way it ends is the way I wanted it to end, from the beginning. That was conceptually how I wanted to sort of design the film, because I felt that the complicity for the death penalty is something that should be felt by the audience, and that's why I ended the film that way. And in order to reach that point, it was a challenge to be able to find that balance, so that we could effectively end the film that way. And so the first 3 years of researching, writing, and developing the film was very much spent also in making sure that the characters were full enough, had enough backstory and internal conflicts for the story to be able to propel him in that direction. Yeah.
And I'm curious, can you explain, because I think for Americans, we all have an idea that Singapore, the justice system there is very tough. But can you just explain briefly, and I know it's not easy, where capital punishment figures in the Singaporean justice system? Is it something that's very common? Is it used very rarely? What kind of crimes is there? And is there much controversy over it in Singapore?
It does remain quite a controversial subject, especially when there are cases that become quite high profile. And a lot of the capital punishment applies in Singapore to murder, to firearms discharge, to quite a unlawful firearms discharge, and several other crimes. But the most controversial one would be for drugs trafficking, and that tends to be the one that attracts the most media attention, especially internationally, and especially when foreigners are caught with drugs in Singapore, or trafficking drugs in Singapore or through Singapore. So that tends to be the most contentious point where capital punishment is concerned in Singapore. And I think I've always been against the death penalty, but I hold the unpopular view, because I think the reality in Singapore is that it is a very safe city to live in, and a lot of the sense of safety and security that people feel is attributed to the tough laws that exist, and capital punishment kind of represents that, and people tend to not feel very comfortable when this issue is addressed, because it would seem like activists are trying to rock the boat for this sense of safety, this bubble that people feel safe within, and that's one of the reasons why when making this film I felt that it was necessary for people who feel for either sides, basically people on either sides of the fence, are able to come and watch it and make a decision for themselves. I do think that people, very often we say that whoever who claims to be for the death penalty, in Singapore at least, tends to say it without much consideration, because it is something that is very much out of sight and out of mind. And I wanted the story to reach out to these people as a sort of a point of entry for them to an issue that is otherwise very rarely discussed in the mainstream media in Singapore.
So actually, just the last question, second to the last question I had is, how many executions are there each year in Singapore?
I don't know, and we don't know.
Okay.
Because it's not a published figure.
Oh, it's not? Okay. And the other question I had is, you must be working on another film now. What are you starting work on?
Right now, I am just thinking. I'm starting development, but it will take a few more years before the next film is done. Hopefully not another 5, but I have several ideas in mind, but I just want to sit on it for a little bit to figure out what the point of entry would be for some of these stories that I want to tell. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. Have fun in Tokyo. And Apprentice opens tomorrow at Village East in New York City. Talk to you in 5 years.
Thank you.